Beyond the Gates spoilers teased that Joey and Marcel had quietly made a pact in the shadows, a secret clause buried beneath layers of deceit and half-truths that no one else could fully untangle. Their alliance was not the kind of partnership built on trust but on desperation, with both men realizing that survival in this game depended on who they could manipulate, who they could silence, and who they could burn to the ground before their own reputations collapsed. Joey was the first to play his hand. He knew Doug was moving faster than anyone gave him credit for, pulling strings behind the scenes, collecting files, and piecing together a case that could drag Joey into the dirt and expose every dark deal he had ever touched. And the cruel irony: Vanessa, the one woman Joey thought he could still bend, had the evidence in her possession. She was the keeper of the ledger, the vault of recordings, the one person who could either save him or end him with a single word to the wrong authority. But Joey wasn't the type to wait for the hammer to fall. If Doug thought he was in control, he was dead wrong. Joey set the stage carefully, playing the part of a man caught off guard when in reality every piece of the board was shifting exactly where he wanted it. Meeting Marcel wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated move to ensure that Doug's plan would collapse before it even had the chance to breathe. Marcel, with his own shady connections and insatiable greed, was the perfect ally in a war where betrayal was the only constant. Together they mapped out a counter-strike. Joey knew he couldn't outmuscle Doug in raw influence, but he could dismantle him piece by piece, starting with the foundation of his so-called case. The first crack appeared when whispers began to circulate that someone close to Doug had already turned against him. Bill or Haley, one of them had spilled, though no one could say with certainty who had betrayed him. Too damaging to have come from anywhere else. Doug's plan had always depended on secrecy, on moving unseen. But once word leaked that he had gathered incriminating material about Joey's laundering operation with Vanessa, everything shifted. Joey seized on the moment with ruthless efficiency. He knew that once suspicion was planted, it would fester like poison in Doug's circle. Paranoia would eat Doug alive from the inside out. But paranoia alone wasn't enough. Joey wanted destruction. Total erasure of the trail that connected him to Vanessa. So he set in motion a fire that no one could extinguish, a literal one. The real estate office Vanessa ran, the one that held not just property files but also encrypted documents, accounts, and secret backups, was chosen as the target. To the outside world it would look like an accident, an unfortunate explosion triggered by faulty wiring or careless storage. But Joey knew better. He made sure the blast would obliterate every trace of their shared sins, the shell companies, the laundering transfers, the side deals masked as commissions. He didn't need to confront Vanessa head-on, not yet. He just needed her leverage to vanish into smoke and ash. On the morning the flames roared, Vanessa was far from the city, waking slowly in a hotel bed on the outskirts of town. Joey was beside her, his breathing steady, his face calm, the very picture of a man without worry. When her phone rang and Jacob's voice came through, her whole expression hardened. The words Jacob delivered were urgent, sharp enough to cut through her still groggy state. Something had happened, something catastrophic. She sat upright, her pulse racing, and for a moment her eyes darted toward Joey, searching for some sign of recognition, some flicker of surprise or concern. But Joey didn't even glance up. He already knew what Jacob was saying. He had orchestrated it, pulled the wires, lit the fuse. The silence in his demeanor was the silence of a man who controlled the storm while everyone else scrambled for shelter. Vanessa understood the implications almost instantly. The evidence, the proof she had stored so carefully, was gone. Jacob's tone confirmed it. The explosion wasn't survivable, not for files, not for backups. Her leverage had gone up in flames, leaving her exposed in ways she hadn't anticipated. And yet, Joey didn't press her with questions. He didn't even feign curiosity. That was perhaps the most chilling part. He already knew everything, which meant this wasn't chance. This wasn't misfortune, it was design. Vanessa stared at him, her lips pressed tightly together, a dozen calculations running through her mind. Joey had outplayed her without even needing to confront her directly. But that didn't mean he was safe. Doug wasn't going to roll over so easily. The question hanging in the air was whether Joey would now try to turn the tables completely, accusing Doug of laundering instead, spinning the narrative until Doug became the scapegoat for the sins Joey himself had orchestrated. Joey was a master of blame shifting, a man who could rewrite history with such conviction that even his enemies began to doubt themselves. If he chose to, he could plant the evidence, redirect suspicion, and make Doug the fall guy in a scandal that had more layers than anyone could count. The possibility wasn't just real, it was likely. Doug, meanwhile, was cornered. He had wanted to play the role of hunter, to be the one holding the chain and yanking Joey into submission. Instead, he found himself staring down a future where his own name might be dragged through the mud. The rumors swirling didn't help. Word was spreading that Doug and Marcel had been seen together at Joey's casino, locked in tense conversation that had left witnesses uneasy. The fact that Marcel, Joey's ally, was also seen with Doug sent the wrong kind of signals to Jacob and others watching from the periphery. What were they plotting? Was Doug feeding information about Joey's bribes to Jacob in exchange for protection? Or was it Marcel feeding Doug just enough intel to set him up for failure? The air thickened with distrust, every glance weighted with suspicion, every whisper sharpening into knives. For Doug, the casino meeting was supposed to be strategic, a chance to feel out Marcel and perhaps find a weak point in Joey's armor. But the optics were disastrous. To outsiders, it looked like collusion. To Joey, it looked like betrayal. And to Jacob, who had already been sniffing around the edges of the scandal, it looked like confirmation that something bigger was unfolding beneath the surface. Each man believed he was playing the smarter game, but the reality was that they were tangled in a web too complex for any of them to control fully. The most haunting question wasn't who would win, it was who would be sacrificed. Joey had already proven he was willing to torch everything just to save himself. Doug had proven he would risk alliances to gather power. Marcel was straddling the line, feeding both sides just enough to stay useful. And Vanessa, stripped of her leverage, was suddenly the most vulnerable piece on the board. The storm had only begun, and the blood price had yet to be paid. And yet the most dangerous element of all was the way Joey carried himself through it. He moved with the confidence of a man convinced he could never be cornered. He smiled where others panicked. He let Vanessa stew in her unease without lifting a finger. He let Doug twist in paranoia while leaking just enough information to make him look weak. He let Jacob believe he was sniffing out the truth while carefully feeding him half-lies that would divert suspicion. Joey wasn't just playing one opponent, was orchestrating all of them, ensuring that no matter who fell, the blame would never fully land on his shoulders. This phase of the story was only the beginning, but it already revealed the true shape of the war, not a clash of fists or bullets, but a battlefield where perception, deception, and betrayal were the only weapons that mattered. And in that battlefield, Joey was sharpening his knives with terrifying precision. The fallout from the explosion sent invisible shockwaves through every corner of their lives. Vanessa, still shaken by the sudden erasure of her leverage, could not decide whether to confront Joey or to bide her time. She knew his hand was behind it, yet the absence of proof made her powerless. Every instinct told her she was being boxed into a position where silence was her only shield. And yet silence was dangerous, because Doug was circling, more desperate by the hour, more reckless in his determination to claw back control. Doug's paranoia had evolved into a monster of its own. The betrayal from within his circle, whether it had come from Bill or Haley, haunted him relentlessly. Bill had always struck him as ambitious but careless, the kind of man who might have cracked under pressure or traded information for quick protection. Haley, on the other hand, had the calculating patience to play both sides, smiling as she sharpened the knife behind his back. He couldn't know for certain, but the uncertainty was eating him alive. Every time he spoke to either of them, he saw the reflection of treachery in their eyes, whether it was really there or not. In that fragile state of mind, Doug made mistakes. He reached out to Jacob with hints and fragments, testing the waters, dangling the possibility that Joey's laundering could be exposed if only Jacob gave him the backing he needed. But Marcel was already 2 steps ahead. Marcel had his own agenda, and aligning with Joey gave him a kind of immunity he could never achieve on his own. By feeding half-truths to Doug, Marcel ensured that Doug would overplay his hand and look unreliable to Jacob. He deliberately kept the man teetering on the edge, making sure Doug was seen as unstable, too compromised to be trusted. Vanessa observed all of this from the margins, and though her personal losses weighed heavily, she began to see an opening. Joey might have destroyed her evidence, but the power he exercised was not limitless. His arrogance could be weaponized. She began to consider whether Doug, paranoid though he was, could still be useful. If she aligned with him carefully, feeding him the right words at the right time, perhaps she could redirect his desperation toward Joey in ways that would fracture their fragile alliances. The risk was enormous, but Vanessa understood better than anyone that survival required boldness. Joey, meanwhile, thrived in the chaos. He played his role perfectly, the calm in the storm, the man everyone underestimated because he appeared untouchable. But beneath that calm exterior, he was constantly recalculating, adjusting the strings he pulled to make sure no one realized how precarious his control really was. He suspected Vanessa's silence meant she was plotting. He suspected Doug would not back down until he was broken. He knew Jacob was hungry for more than Whispers wanted proof, solid enough to justify his growing involvement. That hunger could either destroy Joey or become his greatest advantage, depending on how he fed it. The casino meeting continued to cast a long shadow. Rumors multiplied. Some said Doug had tried to bribe Marcel, others whispered that Marcel had been the one demanding payment in exchange for loyalty. Jacob received conflicting reports, each painting a different picture of who was betraying whom. It was the kind of ambiguity Joey thrived on, because in the absence of clarity, he could shape the narrative however he wanted. He whispered to Jacob that Doug was drowning in debt, that his paranoia made him reckless, that any information Doug offered was tainted. At the same time, he hinted to Vanessa that Marcel's loyalty was shaky, planting the idea that she could turn Marcel if she played her cards right. He thrived on the fractures, widening them until no one could tell where the truth ended and his lies began. Doug, in his desperation, began to believe that Vanessa might still hold fragments of the evidence, pieces that had somehow survived the explosion. That belief gave him the courage to approach her directly, a move that might have once seemed unthinkable. Their meeting was tense, filled with accusations and half-promises. Vanessa did not deny his suspicions, nor did she confirm them. Instead, she fed him just enough to keep his paranoia alive, just enough to make him believe she could be the key to his survival. She spoke of Joey's arrogance, of the way he had orchestrated the blast, of how he believed he was untouchable. She did not promise alliance, but she allowed Doug to believe it was possible. Bill and Haley remained shadows on the edge of the conflict, but their presence loomed large. Bill, nervous and unpredictable, tried to align himself with whichever side looked stronger at any given moment. He whispered warnings to Doug while simultaneously offering reassurances to Joey. His duplicity made him a liability, and both men began to question whether Bill's existence was more dangerous than useful. Haley, by contrast, stayed unnervingly calm. She cultivated closeness with Marcel, pretending to be fascinated by his schemes, while quietly watching for cracks she could exploit. If Doug fell, she would not fall with him. If Joey rose higher, she would claim she had always supported him. Her survival instincts were sharper than Bill's bluster, and that made her far more dangerous. Jacob, standing at the edge of the web, grew impatient. He had tolerated the games long enough. He wanted names, numbers, accounts, and signature, something he could act on. The more he pushed, the more Joey smiled, offering pieces that seemed valuable but never quite added up to the whole picture. Marcel, sensing Jacob's growing impatience, tried to feed him tidbits that painted Doug as the weakest link. Vanessa, meanwhile, understood that Jacob's hunger for proof might eventually give her a way back into control. If she could find even the smallest piece of surviving evidence or manufacture one convincing enough, she could tip the balance back in her favor. The war was no longer about evidence alone. It was about perception, loyalty, and the stories they spun around one another. Doug was painted as paranoid and unreliable. Vanessa was painted as vulnerable and cornered. Marcel was painted as opportunistic and greedy. Joey was painted as untouchable, though in reality he was holding the thinnest threads of control together by sheer willpower. Bill and Haley were painted as traitors in waiting, though their true roles remained obscured. Jacob was painted as the arbiter, though he had no idea how deeply he was being manipulated by those around him. Every step forward deepened the fractures, every whispered rumor hardened into a potential truth. The closer each of them came to striking, the more likely it became that the final blow would not be against their enemy, but against themselves. And yet none of them could stop. The game had escalated too far, the stakes had grown too high, and retreat was no longer an option. The path ahead was lined with betrayal. Joey knew it. Doug knew it. Vanessa knew it. Marcel knew it. Even Bill and Haley sensed it in their own ways. And Jacob, though still convinced he could extract the truth, would soon realize that the truth had been buried long ago, beneath layers of lies, manipulations, and desperate deals made in the dark. The board was set, the pieces in motion, and the storm was only beginning to break. The tension that had been simmering among them finally began to boil over. Each move they made carried heavier consequences, and by now there were no safe plays left. Joey had built his empire of lies with careful precision, but the cracks were widening, not from a lack of control but from the sheer number of people caught in his net. Each one was a potential traitor, each one a potential weapon, and sooner or later one of them would strike. Doug's paranoia evolved into recklessness. He convinced himself that if he didn't act soon, Joey would crush him entirely. Vanessa's ambiguous promises gave him enough fuel to launch his final move. He attempted to go directly to Jacob with what he claimed was proof. But the files he produced were incomplete, tampered with, and deliberately planted by Marcel. Instead of bringing clarity, they muddied the waters further, making Doug look unstable. Jacob, frustrated, began to see him not as a whistleblower but as a liability. Doug's desperation became his undoing, and Joey could see it happening even before Jacob dismissed Doug outright. Vanessa, watching Doug collapse, felt a pang of regret. She had nurtured his desperation as a weapon against Joey, but she had underestimated how quickly he would burn out. Still, his fall gave her insight. If Doug could be destroyed by his paranoia, then Joey could be destroyed by his arrogance. She began to work silently, reconstructing whatever fragments of evidence she could: old emails, stray contracts, financial inconsistencies that hadn't been swept up by the explosion. Alone, each piece was worthless. Together, if woven carefully, they could resemble something close to the truth. Enough, perhaps, to sway Jacob's judgment. Marcel, for his part, was no longer content being Joey's shadow. His alliance had given him power, but power was addictive, and he wanted more. He began to consider whether Joey's fall might benefit him more than Joey's survival. The thought was dangerous, but Marcel thrived on dangerous thoughts. If he could position himself as the man who handed Jacob the truth while simultaneously keeping Joey's trust, he could rise higher than either of them. Bill, sensing the shifting tides, grew more frantic. He feared that whichever side fell first, he would be blamed as the mole. His attempts to play both sides only drew suspicion, and soon both Joey and Vanessa began to question his loyalty. Haley, ever the colder strategist, stayed quiet and watched Bill dig his own grave. If she betrayed Doug earlier, she felt no remorse. Survival mattered more than allegiance. And if Bill collapsed under the weight of suspicion, it would only make her safer. The true climax arrived in a series of confrontations, not in grand gestures but in small, precise detonations of trust. Doug attempted one last desperate strike against Joey, cornering him in the casino where this tangled mess had first begun. He accused him openly, raving about bribes, laundering, and betrayals. But Joey, calm as ever, turned the accusation back on him. He pointed to the tampered files Doug had shown Jacob, painting him as a liar and a fraud. The onlookers, already skeptical of Doug, sided with Joey's composure. It was the final nail in Doug's coffin. Within days, Doug disappeared from the circle entirely. Whether he fled, was silenced, or simply broke under the pressure, no one could say for sure. His absence left a vacuum, and everyone rushed to fill it. Vanessa, now armed with reconstructed evidence, made her move. She approached Jacob not with panic but with quiet certainty. She showed him the fragments she had gathered, framing them as proof that Joey had manipulated everything, even Doug's downfall. Jacob listened, skeptical but intrigued. For the first time, Joey's untouchable facade began to waver. Marcel, seeing Vanessa's maneuver, had to decide whether to side with Joey or betray him. His choice was pragmatic. He had already fed Jacob pieces that discredited Doug. If he now supported Vanessa, presenting her fragments as genuine, Jacob would see Marcel as the consistent threat man who had guided him through the fog. Marcel took the risk. He shifted allegiance, aligning subtly with Vanessa, and together they began to paint Joey not as the mastermind but as the liability. When Joey realized the turn, it was already too late. His arrogance had blinded him to the slow erosion of loyalty around him. Vanessa, whom he had tried to disarm with fire, now stood in front of him wielding the weapon he thought he had destroyed. Marcel, whom he believed bound by their secret claws, had quietly unbound himself. Bill had collapsed into irrelevance, and Haley, ever adaptable, had drifted to the winning side without anyone needing to ask. The final confrontation was quiet, almost anticlimactic compared to the chaos that had preceded it. Jacob sat across from Joey, the fragments spread out before him, Marcel and Vanessa present as witnesses. Joey tried his usual tricks: deflection, charm, twisting the narrative until the victim looked like the villain. But this time his words didn't land. Jacob had grown weary of games. Vanessa's calm presentation, Marcel's corroboration, and Doug's absence all combined to paint a picture Joey couldn't escape. He didn't go down with a bang. There was no dramatic arrest, no violent showdown. Joey's punishment was slower, sharper: isolation. One by one, his allies slipped away. Marcel took over pieces of his business. Vanessa reclaimed her leverage, turning her fragments into a shield of protection. Haley secured her safety by aligning with Marcel, while Bill's name disappeared, swallowed by the shadows of suspicion. Jacob, satisfied enough, moved forward with the narrative that Joey had been the mastermind all along. Joey remained standing, but alone. For a man who had built his power on manipulation, solitude was the harshest sentence imaginable. The empire he had crafted with deception became his prison, each brick a reminder of the alliances he had destroyed, the trust he had burned, the arrogance that had blinded him. The storm ended not with clarity but with silence. The truth was never fully revealed, too many lies had been layered over it. But in the end, it didn't matter. Perception was reality, and perception had chosen Joey as the villain. The others survived, some stronger, some scarred, but Joey's downfall was complete. And somewhere, in the quiet corners beyond the chaos, the game reset itself, waiting for the next betrayal to spark a new fire.